Judges ready? Negative team ready? The island kingdom of Bahrain, located in the Persian Gulf, is a longtime purchaser of American military equipment. Bahrain is a key U.S. ally and home to the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, which is vital in protecting the oil trade in the Persian Gulf and conducting military operations throughout the Middle East. The kingdom's defense depends on the United States for weapons and the protection offered by the Fifth Fleet. The Sunni Muslim government severely discriminates against the majority Shia Muslim population, and its law enforcement has been known to abuse its power, including using torture against detainees. Starting in 2001, protests broke out against corruption in the government. Bahrain security forces violently cracked down on the peaceful protests, resulting in numerous fatalities and arbitrary arrests. The last few years have only seen an increase in such behavior. According to the Human Rights Watch 2014 report on Bahrain, quote, Bahrain's human rights record regressed further in key areas in 2013, and the government made little real progress regarding reforms it claimed to pursue. Security forces continued to arrest scores of individuals arbitrarily in towns where anti-government protests regularly take place. Continuing reports of torture and ill treatment in detention were consistent with the findings of the 2011 Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry. The government's failure to implement key recommendations of the BICI stand in contrast to its claims it is making progress on human rights. The judicial system, headed by ruling family members, has yet to hold any senior official responsible for serious human rights violations that have occurred since 2011, including torture-related deaths in detention. Unquote. The armored vehicles, helicopters, and small arms being used to violently disperse protesters are largely from the United States. Despite this rampant misuse of American-made military equipment, the federal government has continued to allow sales of most weapons to Bahrain. Because Bahrain depends on military support from the United States, these sales should be used to encourage reform and respect for human rights. Political instability also threatens our alliance with Bahrain and the security of the Fifth Fleet stationed in Manama. For these reasons, the Affirmative team stands firmly resolved that the United States federal government should reform its policy for the sale of conventional arms to one or more of the following: Bahrain, Taiwan, or Egypt. The Affirmative team will be running a needs analysis case. To promote clarity in the round, we will first define the important terms. We will then identify two significant harms of the status quo and propose a plan to solve these problems. Observation 1, definitions. Unless otherwise stated, all definitions are from the Merriam-Webster's Online Dictionary 2015. Reform, to put or change into an improved form or condition. Policy, a high-level overall plan embracing the general goals and acceptable procedures, especially of a governmental body. Sale, the act of selling, specifically the transfer of ownership of and title to property from one person to another for price. From the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Conventional weapons, weapons and military equipment that do not use biological agents, chemical agents, nuclear explosives, or kinetic energy to damage targets. Observation 2, the harms. Harm 1. The United States has continued to supply weapons to Bahrain, failing to effectively use the political leverage of arms sales to stimulate reform. Significance. The U.S. has failed to back its criticism of Bahrain with serious consequences. From Plan B for Bahrain, Human Rights First, November 2013, quote, the U.S. government approach to Bahrain appears to have been ambiguous and inconsistent, arming the regime while making critical statements about its human rights violations. As of September 2013, Brookings' paper on U.S. relations with Egypt noted, if Arab leaders know that the United States will not back up its pro-democracy rhetoric with policy changes that go beyond tinkering around the margins, they are unlikely to take U.S. objections over human rights concerns seriously. Unquote. Impact 1. Unless Bahrain is pressured, human rights violations will continue. From Bahrain 2013 Human Rights Report, Department of State, quote, the most serious human rights problems include citizens' inability to change their government peacefully, arrest and detention of protesters on vague charges, in some cases leading to their torture and detention, and lack of due process in trials of political and human rights activists, medical personnel, teachers, and students, with some trials resulting in harsh sentences. Other significant human rights problems include arbitrary deprivation of life, lack of consistent accountability for security officers accused of committing human rights violations, arrested for Individuals on charges relating to freedom of expression reported violations of privacy and restrictions on civil liberties, including freedom of speech, press, assembly, association, and some religious practices." Unquote. Impact 2. Political instability threatens U.S. interests, including the security of the Fifth Fleet. From Commander Richard McDaniel, No Plan B, Brookings, June 2013. Quote, "If significant democratic reforms are not achieved and the Shia majority does not gain a greater voice, then the chance of a Shia revolution will increase substantially. America has a strong history of advocating for democracy around the globe, and for the U.S.-Bahrain partnership to continue to be successful, democratic reforms in Bahrain must be part of the stability discussion. Failure to adjust them could ultimately result in a new government or a political environment that is no longer hospitable to a U.S. military presence." Unquote. Harm 2. The United States has continued to sell Bahrain weapons that can be used against protesters. Justin Elliott revealed Americans' arms sales to Bahrain amid bloody crackdown, ProPublica, January 15, 2013. Quote, "Despite Bahrain's bloody crackdown on pro-democracy protesters, the U.S. has continued to provide weapons and maintenance to the small Mideast nation. Defense Department documents released to the ProPublica give the fullest picture yet of the arms sales. The list includes ammunition, combat vehicle parts, communications equipment, Black Hawk helicopters, and an unidentified missile system. While the U.S. has maintained it is selling Bahrain arms only for external defense, human rights advocates say the documents raise questions about items that could be used against civilian protesters." Unquote. Observation 3, Plan 1, Mandate. All arms sales to Bahrain will require certification by the U.S. Secretary of State that Bahrain is respecting the fundamental human rights recognized in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which include liberty and due process of law. 2, Agency. Any necessary subsidiaries of the federal government. 3, Funding, normal means. 4, Enforcement, normal means. 5, Addendum. The affirmative team reserves the right to expound upon this plan as necessary. Observation 4, Advantages. Advantage 1. Since Bahrain relies on U.S. military assistance, suspending sales will encourage respect for human rights and reform throughout a peaceful transition rather than a revolution that would threaten U.S. interests. As before cited, as Bahrain slides towards greater instability, it is time for the United States to adopt a more active approach, making it clear that there will be severe consequences for Bahrain if they fail to reform." Unquote. Advantage 2. The risk of future U.S. weapons sales being used in violations of human rights will decrease. According to Plan B for Bahrain, as before cited, quote, "On human rights, the United States must be a beacon. Activists fighting for freedom around the globe continue to look at us for inspiration and count on us for support." Unquote. Thank you, and I now stand open for cross-examination and further clarification.
Hi, Hope.
Hey.
What does this have to do with submarines?
Haha,
I'm just being silly. Okay. Let's go on to my first question, which is it the stance of the affirmative team that that the Fifth Fleet currently is going to move out of Bahrain because of the current situation?
No, not necessarily, but there is a threat in the area if this instability increases.
Okay, so if we don't enact your plan, the Fifth Fleet will be forced to move?
There's always a possibility, yes.
Okay.
We can bring up evidence on this later in the round.
So my question for you under the mandate is who currently has control over the arms sales and approving whether or not they go through to Bahrain?
The United States.
Okay, but who in the United States?
I don't have that up with me at the time.
Is it possible that the Secretary of State is actually already involved in the process?
Yes, the Secretary of State, I'm looking at it right now. The Secretary of State would be in charge of this, but we would change.
Okay, but not under your plan, but under the status quo.
Yes, I believe so, but again, my partner can expound on this.
Okay. My next question is, what exactly is the criteria for respecting human rights violations in Bahrain, or like respecting human rights in terms of the UN treaty? That has 33 articles in it. How many of them do they have to meet?
Essentially, they would have to be respecting, the human rights. Obviously, we read evidence talking about how...
Yeah, but what's the criteria for that?
The criteria would that be those would diminish.
So do they have to be perfect?
There would have to be a significant advance towards that.
Okay, so what is a significant advance?
not happening what's happening in the status quo, essentially.
Okay, so if we eliminate just a few of the human rights violations, but there are still some going on, are we going to sell all arms to them?
Sorry, could you rephrase
Are we not
that?
going to sell arms to them?
Could you rephrase that? If there's only a small?
Basically, yeah, if they can eliminate the fact that there's not fair trial, for example.
No, there would have to be a significant
What's significant?
reform in that area.
How
We
many?
can bring up evidence on exactly what the standard would be later, but at this time, whatever's going on in the status quo now would have to be gone.
Okay, completely gone?
Yes, well, most of it.
Okay. My next question for you is, can you reread the tag on Advantage 1 for me, please?
Yeah. Since Bahrain relies on U.S. military assistance, suspending sales will encourage respect for human rights and reform through a peaceful transition rather than a revolution that would threaten United States interests.
Okay. Does the United States currently sell arms to Bahrain that contribute to human rights violations?
Even if they didn't, and I'm not sure exactly what the status quo is at the time, but even if they didn't, we would still be supporting a government that has human rights violations, even if we weren't selling them the specific weapons that were used against the people.
Okay. And then can you reread the tag on Advantage 2 for me, please?
Yes. The risk of future U.S. weapons sales being used in violation of human rights will decrease.
Okay. I think that's all I have. Thank you. No further questions.
I'd like to start off this round by illustrating the real situation in Bahrain. The affirmative team read multiple pieces of evidence talking about how they're just shooting down peaceful protesters, and the government is basically doing things, and the protesters are not doing anything in response. They're just peaceful and just having demonstrations that are completely peaceful. And I'd like to dispel this with a piece of evidence from the article, Two Sides to the Story in Bahrain, from the Bahrain Monitor, which is a human rights organization, and they're analyzing the past few years in Bahrain. Quote, it is very important to realize that a political conflict which reflects itself in the street will eventually lead to breaches and human rights violations on both sides. So we need to enter into this round with realizing it's not all on the Bahrain government, it is both. In the Middle East, protests tend to be violent, so it's not completely on the US government or on the Bahrain government. The problem is not all theirs. So with that in mind, we also want to look into one more thing before we enter their case. That when they're quoting human rights organizations, like, for example, they quoted one called the Human Rights Watch. It's important that we realize that these kind of organizations, their entire job is to search out human rights violations, so bias is a big problem here. I'd like to read a piece of evidence illustrating this. This is from the article, Far Beyond the Curve, HRW's, or Human Rights Watch's, bias and lack of credibility in 2012 from the non-governmental organization Monitor, October 2013. Quote, in particular, HRW's activities reflect the absence of professional standards and research methodologies, lack of expertise on international law and armed conflict, and a deep-seated ideological bias against democracies in general and against Israel and in particular. This is talking about how Human Rights Watch is an extremely biased source, and we can illustrate this as they read from more human rights organizations, so that's their job to find human rights violations, so they can have a certain bias involved. So now that we have those things addressed, let's move into their case, starting off with harm one. Now we've inherency points that are going to fall under both of the harms, one of which is that the United States is pressuring Bahrain, and that arms sales are not continuing that have anything to do with human rights violations. And I'd like to read an article from ProPublica on January 15th, 2013. Quote, State Department spokesman Noel Clay told ProPublica, quote, we continue to withhold the export of lethal and crowd control items intended predominantly for internal security purposes, and have resumed on a case-by-case basis items related exclusively to external defense, counterterrorism, and the protection of U.S. forces. So nothing that has anything to do with internal security. The United States is watching the situation. They are pressuring Bahrain, and they're not selling them anything that would have anything to do with human rights violations, nothing for internal security. And even for things like counterterrorism and external defense, they're being careful about it. It's on a case-by-case basis. They're analyzing it very carefully. So both these issues inherency fall under these. Again, the affirmative speaker in cross-examination was a little unsure if we're selling them arms currently that have anything to do with human rights violations. And seeing that their second harm is that U.S. arms are being used for human rights violations, they are unclear if they are, and we have provided evidence that they aren't. So clearly under that harm, at least we are clearly proving that they're inherent in the first one as well, because we're not selling them arms that have anything to do with human rights. And also, another inherency point is that Bahrain is working on the issue, that Bahrain is recognizing the U.S. is putting arms stoppages on them. So we are pressuring them, and here's their response to the outcries from different countries in the past. This is from an article from the Al Monitor, June 13, 2014. This is quoting the head of the BICI, which is the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry. The affirmative team quoted them as well in their case. I'd like to read what the president of this group, or the head of this group, said about Bahrain. Quote, the Bahraini government has made substantial progress since the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry in 2011. That was the observation of Sharif Boussini, who headed the BICI, and told Al Monitor during an exclusive interview at the Brookings Institution's U.S. Islamic World Forum in Doha. The government has consistently carried out the implementation of the recommendations. So even they said that Bahrain, or the BICI issued some recommendations, and Bahrain is pushing forward to meet those, showing they're eager to push reform. And so we see major inherency points under both these points. And if they could also clarify what U.S. arms are being used in human rights violations. So several points that need some clarification. Also, both these harms are not inherent. So now that we move to address some of the issues under the harms, let's move into the mandate. Now, right off the bat, we see some solvency issues here. First of all, the Secretary of State is supposed to certify that they're meeting the UN Human Rights Declaration. I'd like to point out, and this was admitted by the affirmative team in cross-examination, the Secretary of State is first of all, the head of the Department of State, and they're one of the biggest agencies that approve government sales. And so he's already heavily involved. So where's your solvency? Where's the huge differences in the status quo? Because this is very similar to what is already present. So where is the big difference? And is Secretary of State John Kerry going to be able to make a decision that is not biased even in there? So several problems here. Where's the difference in the status quo that compared to now, with their case being passed, assuming it would, for example. So several problems there. And also the UN Human Rights Declaration. We need some clarification on what exactly it is. They said it was something about human rights issues, and obviously we understand that if it's called the UN Human Rights Declaration. But what exactly is it? What does it comply with? What nations have to meet it? Just some overall clarification, because we see that they're supposed to certify they meet this. First of all, do you have to meet everything in the UN Human Rights Declaration exactly, or do they have to meet it partially? The affirmative team was a little unclear about this. They sort of said they have to, show they're making significant improvement. Well, first of all, we read evidence saying they are making significant improvement anyways. But where is the criteria? We have not been provided one by the affirmative team. What criteria does the Secretary of State have? Is there this human rights violation means they violate this one? Basically, it's just him writing a checkoff mark, basically saying, oh, well, they respect human rights according to the UN Human Rights Declaration. So if we could have some clarification, and overall, there's no criteria under this mandate. So now, moving down into the advantage, basically they're going to reform, basically they're going to pressure Bahrain to reform under Advantage 1. It's going to be through peaceful processes, and they're not going to have issues like revolution. There's just going to be reform. Well, first of all, they're already working on reform. And again, under this advantage, it's kind of linked to, again, Harm 1, where they're talking about the Fifth Fleet. I'd like to read a piece of evidence saying that the Fifth Fleet is not in danger. And they read no evidence saying there is danger currently in Bahrain. And I'd like to read this piece of evidence. It's from the Commander Richard McDaniel from the article, No Plan B, U.S. Strategic Access in the Middle East and the Question of Bahrain, the Brookings Institute, June 2013. Quote, conventional wisdom from most U.S. military experts and planners in the Department of Defense, is that losing Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain is highly unlikely, and the Saudis and the United States would never allow it. So kind of moving back to their Harm 1 and Advantage 1 at the same time, it's never going to happen. The United States is going to lose one of their biggest fleet bases. That's not, the United States isn't going to allow it, and the countries around Bahrain aren't going to allow it. So their harm, the Fifth Fleet is endangered, or Harm 1 and Advantage 1 sort of combined, that's not an issue. And again, pressuring them to reform, we're doing that. And the thing is, we have to look at an overarching policy. We need to have a balance between pushing for reform and achieving strategic objectives. We can't just throw everything in the way, basically say human rights is our only focus and we'll throw everything out the door. We need to have what we're doing now. Nothing for internal security, but supporting their counterterrorism efforts. So we're sort of engaged still, but we are showing our displeasure at the same time. Those things are key in the advantages, and the affirmative team would be messing up this balance. Again, under Advantage 2, the arms basically would be a decrease in U.S. arms contributing to human rights violations. They're unsure even if they are, and we've shown that they're not. So clearly, under both these advantages and overall their harms, there's major inherency issues, significance issues, and solvency issues. And for these reasons, I stand open for cross-examination and clarification.
Hello, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. How about you?
Great, thank you. All right, a few questions. You read evidence from the Department of State, I believe?
Yes, I did.
So how can we really trust the Department of State in this situation?
Since they're the ones conducting the arms sales, I would have to say yes. And actually, you read from the Department of State as well concerning Bahrain. So
okay.
We're incompatible, and we both read from the Department of State.
Got it. Okay, thank you. And you read evidence talking about how Bahrain has made progress. How much progress has Bahrain made?
Well, we can continue to expound on that, but overall, basically, the recommendations provided by the BICI, I believe they were in the hundreds of them, and they're making significant progress, like, implementing them.
Hundreds, what a percentage maybe?
We'll bring up some evidence talking about exactly what recommendations were released by human rights groups, but overall, the president just certified overall Bahrain, they're making significant improvement. The president of the BICI, which you quoted as well.
Okay, got it. Okay, so you're saying Bahrain has made significant reform because we've been holding back some of those arms?
Yes, that could be very well the case.
Okay, got it. All right, and does the United States decide if the Fifth Fleet stays?
Well, the point in saying that was, first of all, you've read no evidence saying there's any instability going on that's like threatening us right now, so the harm that is kind of vague, and also that the United States and many countries aren't going to allow the little country of Bahrain to disrupt the whole area by kicking the United States out. And Bahrain wouldn't even want this anyways.
All right, did you read any evidence stating that?
Yes, I read evidence saying that none of the countries around there, like Saudi Arabia or the United States, is not going to allow Bahrain to kick them out.
Could you reread that? Sorry.
Yes, I could reread that. Excuse me, find it. Okay. Do I see just the quote?
Yeah.
Okay. Conventional wisdom from most U.S. military experts and planners in the Department of Defense is that losing the Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain is highly unlikely, and the Saudis and the United States would never allow it.
Okay, got it. So again, coming back to the question, does the United States decide if the Fifth Fleet stays? You answered saying other countries wouldn't allow it. What about the United States? Is it our decision?
It's our decision whether or not we stay. Well,
if we get kicked out.
If we get kicked out? Well, since that situation is obviously very far off, it's very difficult to see what the United States policy would be if they got kicked out, because that's not even anywhere in the mix right now. So, I mean, we've read evidence stating from credible sources that the U.S. would not allow us. They have the ability to dictate to a tiny island nation in this case.
Okay, got it. And what was your argument under the second term? Your arguments under that?
Well, again, the inherency points, again, they're working on the issue, and your harm was that U.S. arms are being used in human rights violations, which you in cross-examination were a little unsure if that's even happening, and we provided clear evidence that that is not happening in the status quo.
Okay, got it. All right, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you.
It is the stance of the affirmative team that the best thing for the people of Bahrain and U.S. interests is reform, and that is the goal of our plan. Bahrain is highly dependent on U.S. military assistance. Their military is made up almost entirely of our equipment, which means that they need us to continue selling them arms, upgrade their equipment, and maintain their military. So this gives the United States the ability to promote reform. We have political leverage over Bahrain, and currently the United States is failing to use that leverage, which damages our reputation and is not good for the people of Bahrain. It also puts the military base, the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, in significant danger. And I believe the negative team would agree that that Fifth Fleet is extremely important. Now, let's move into the outline of our case. Harm one is that basically we're failing to stimulate reform. We're missing our opportunity. Now, the negative team, in response to our arguments about human rights violations, they said, well, really the protesters have been extremely violent, so the government actions have been justified. However, the protests began peacefully, and they have legitimate demands. The Sunni government has for years discriminated against the Shia majority. They're not allowed to hold government jobs. The police forces discriminate against the Shiites. There have been numerous incidents of torture by the police. So their demands are legitimate, and the government violently cracked down on these protests immediately without proper cause. And of course, it's natural that some of the protesters would react in violence as well, but that doesn't prove that the government is justified in everything they're doing. According to an article by Michael B. Kelly from Business Insider, January 15, 2013, quote, "The U.S. has been selling arms to Bahrain amid the small Middle East nation's increasingly repressive crackdown on pro-democracy protesters. The Bahrain uprising, which initially called for greater political freedom and equality for the majority Shia population, began peacefully in February 2011. It was met with a harsh response by the U.S.-backed Sunni ruling party as unarmed protesters were allegedly detained, tortured, targeted by live ammunition strikes from Cobra helicopters, and thrown in jail for life. That's what's happening in Bahrain right now. Clearly, there is a need for reform. So that's the first part of this harm, that the United States is missing their opportunity to protect the rights of the people of Bahrain. The second impact of this harm is that it threatens the stability of the Fifth Fleet. Now, contrary to what the negative team said, we did read evidence on this point in our case. Basically, the last thing the United States wants is a revolution in Bahrain. And the protesters have shown they're not going away until reforms are made. So the situation is just going to escalate and get worse. Now, to make matters worse, the government in Iran is controlled by the Shia Muslims as well. So they're throwing their support behind these protesters. And Iran is an enemy of Bahrain and the United States. So basically, the last thing we want is a revolution backed by Iran, and the best way to prevent that is to encourage reform peacefully. Now, according to an article, No Plan B, by the Brookings Institute from Commander Richard McDaniel, June 2013, quote, "Recent history, such as the loss of access in Iran and the Philippines, has taught us to expect the unexpected and highlights the reality that the U.S. does not influence every factor that contributes to the loss of access. Assuming that the United States will not lose Bahrain is not a sound course of action. The situation in Bahrain could deteriorate very rapidly, leaving the U.S. without a key maritime hub in the Middle East." And this article is by a federal executive fellow in the United States Navy. He knows what he's talking about. He's talking about the Fifth Fleet. So past evidence, such as losing our alliance with Iran and other countries, shows that it can happen. Iran used to be an ally of the United States. Then a revolution changed the government, and now they're our worst enemy. We don't want Bahrain to turn into another Iran. The best way to do that is to simulate peaceful reform. So that basically sums up our arguments under the first harm. Now, moving on to our second harm, which is that, actually, backing up a moment, they also brought up an inherency point that the government has made reforms. They've taken the recommendations of the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry and made progress. Now, the article, the person that they quoted was the head of the BICI, and he did say that they made some reforms, some progress. However, I'd like to quote the same article and give some additional detail. This is from Al Monitor, same article that they cited, June 13, 2014. Quote, "Bassouni, the head of the BSEI, highlighted the points where actions by the Bahrain government deserve recognition, but said the implementation of the recommendations were being made on a piecemeal level, and thus are losing its cumulative impact. While authorities have improved in certain aspects, the implementation of other key recommendations leave much to be desired. Cases of torture and deaths under torture have not been adequately investigated. They have not been adequately prosecuted. That leaves a great deal to be desired." So the same person is saying, no, they have a lot of progress to make. The reforms are being made on an extremely limited level. And the recommendations were made back in 2011. They've made very little progress over the past 4 years. It's time to start pressuring Bahrain. And we can bring up more recent evidence about human rights violations to prove our point on this in a later speech. So now moving on to the second harm, which is the United States government is still supplying arms to Bahrain that can be used against their own citizens, against the protesters that are there. Now, we read evidence talking about government documents obtained by ProPublica that clearly stated that certain weapons were being sold still that could be used for crowd control, contrary to the claims of the Department of the State. And the documents included things like ammunition, armored vehicle parts. Armored vehicles have been used against protesters. Obviously, ammunition has. And things like helicopters, which have targeted protesters. According to another article from Common Dreams, January 31st, 2012, quote, "Last fall, the Obama administration announced plans to sell Bahrain $53 million worth of military weapons, including bunker buster missiles, armored vehicles, and wire-guided missiles. President Barack Obama's administration has been delaying its planned $53 million arms sales to Bahrain due to human rights concerns and congressional opposition. But this week, administration officials told several congressional offices that they will move forward with a new and different package of arms sales without any formal notification to the public." So Congress didn't approve of their original sale, so they said, okay, we'll do something different, and then they didn't notify them of what was actually being sold. So obviously, something is being hidden here, and according to the documents that we quoted, there is arms being sold that could be used for crowd control. So this is still a problem, and the United States does not want their weapons being used for inappropriate purposes against the citizens of this country. Moving on to our plan. Now here, basically the argument was that it's too vague. Now, the mandate is basically that arms sales will be halted until the Secretary of State has formally certified that Bahrain is respecting the human rights, fundamental human rights, laid out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. Now, obviously, I mean, that's not like a mathematical, I mean, it's not a quantifiable standard, but it's respecting human rights. Now, clearly, Bahrain is so far from meeting that standard. They're torturing people, they're arbitrarily arresting people, people are being killed in the streets. So they're so far from respecting these rights that significant reforms are going to have to be made for them to meet that standard. And this puts, and the Secretary, they argued, well, the Secretary of State is already involved in the approval process. However, we're changing what has to be done. Now, he has to formally certify that Bahrain is respecting human rights. And the Department of State is not going to do that with what's going on right now. That would make them look ridiculous. And there's no reason why they would say they're respecting human rights with all the evidence of what's going on here. So they're going to have to meet a much higher standard in order to receive these arms sales. And secondly, we're not just trying to stop certain arms from going through. We want to cut off all aid so that it will stimulate reform. So in conclusion, the affirmative team's plan will support both the interests of the Bahraini people and the military interest of the United States. Thank you, and I'm now open for cross-examination.
How are you today?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well, too. I'd like to start off with your mandate, if I will. Let's see. Under your United States, the UN Arms Declaration, or the UN Human Rights Declaration, what human rights violations have to be in the status quo for him to certify? Does there have to be none?
Well, obviously, all governments violate human rights, even the United States. No government is perfect, but obviously they're going to have to do a lot more than they're doing now. They're torturing people, they're shooting people in the streets.
Okay.
So they're so far from that standard, significant reforms are going to have to be made.
Okay.
You can't even close to call it respect for human rights.
All right, but once they start getting closer, where's your criteria?
Well, obviously that's up for the Secretary of State to decide, but they're so far from that, there would be a significant amount of improvement. You can't call what they're doing now respect for human rights in any manner.
Okay, so really you have no criteria.
There is most definitely a criteria. We can't have them reach a certain number. I mean, it's not that simple. It's not a quantifiable issue. The Secretary of State will have a reasonable standard of respect for human rights.
And what is that standard?
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
But I mean the standard in which he says that they've met the UN Human Rights Declaration.
Obviously, they're going to have to use their discretion.
Okay, all right. Now, let's see. Did you read evidence saying that they blocked, or the government or Congress blocked a $53 million arms sale, correct, because of human rights concerns?
Yes, and then the government turned around and sold a supposedly different package without telling Congress what it was.
Did it say tell Congress? Could you reread that evidence, please?
Yes, I could. You want me to read the whole thing?
Just the part that talked about it did not report to, or did not basically say did not inform the public.
All right. President Barack Obama's administration has been delaying its planned $53 million arms sales to Bahrain due to human rights concerns and congressional opposition. But this week, administration officials told several congressional offices that they will move forward with a new and different package of arms sales without any formal notification to the public.
Okay, so they told Congress, right? They told
Congress.
They
told them they were going to move through with a different sale.
Okay,
that's all they told them.
Okay, what is the public?
Well, everyone. It's
okay, but is they saying does that mean they didn't inform Congress?
Well, it says that they told them they were moving forward with a different sale without any formal notification. So obviously they did not give them the details of what that was.
Sorry, is it the opinion of the affirmative team that we're selling them stuff, arms that contribute to human rights violations?
Yes.
What arms are those?
Well, the documents that we read evidence on included things like ammunition, armored vehicle parts, and Cobra attack helicopters.
Okay. Now, the evidence you read on that, what is Common Dreams exactly?
It's basically a news source.
Okay. All right. If you could bring up some credentials on that, and the same with the Business Insider, if you could do that as well, because those are two sources you read from that I'm a little unsure of the credentials. All right. I think that's all. Thank you.
We could read sad stories about human rights violations in the Middle East for an entire day. We could find stories about people being shot and killed in Bahrain, and it's not the stance of the negative team that we shouldn't be working to improve these human rights violations. It is in fact the stance of the negative team that we want to do what we're doing in the status quo, which is encourage Bahrain to reform, which the United States has put holds on arms sales that are contributing to human rights violations, and we have read evidence on that and will continue to do so. But so that we're withholding those items in the status quo, and then Bahrain is already working on implementing their human rights recommendations from several different groups. So if this is the situation, then there's really no reason for the affirmative team's plan, and if we do enact it, there will be a significant disadvantage. So first of all, Bahrain is important, and it is important to keep encouraging them with reform by our arms sales. This is from the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs in September of 2013. It says the United States uses all tools available, including foreign assistance, to encourage Bahrain's leadership to implement reforms and respect human rights standards, to make Bahrain a stronger and more interoperable partner for regional peace, security, and counterterrorism cooperation, improve the ability to deny terrorist sponsorship, support, and sanctuary, and boost Bahrain's maritime defenses against smuggling and terrorism. So basically, we have an extremely important position by using our foreign assistance, our foreign arms sales to them, in order to cause them to do the right thing, but also work with them in this very important partnership. And that's something really important to keep in mind as we continue throughout this round. For the first harm, we've already read evidence basically saying that there are two sides to the story in the Middle East and the situation in Bahrain. It's not just that there are these peaceful protesters and the government is going crazy extreme. Now, there are some situations, but you have to realize that some of the human rights violations are also being committed by the protesters. The next point I'd like to make here is that the last affirmative speaker basically said, well, the Department of State's actually lying about how the human rights situation is and what our arms sales to them actually are, when in fact, the Department of State, the head of the Department of State, is actually the one who would be in charge of their plan. So that's a little bit of a contradiction there to say, well, they're lying, they're not qualified, but the head of the Department of State would actually be the one certifying it under their mandates. That's kind of an issue there as well. I'll read another piece of evidence from the Washington Post in 2012 saying the State Department emphasized that equipment being approved was not used for crowd control. Items still on hold besides missiles and Humvees include tear gas launchers, and stun grenades, and those are just examples. This kind of falls under both the harm arguments of basically that we're not doing the right thing in terms of Bahrain and the status quo. And I would like to read some evidence also talking about how Bahrain is actually improving. The last affirmative speaker was saying basically that the BICI isn't really right on the human rights being improved. But I'd like to read from Bahrain, UN Human Rights Review must spur action, from Amnesty International in 2012, saying Bahrain's government has fully accepted more than 140 out of the 176 recommendations stemming from the review, including measures aimed at releasing prisoners of conscience, bolstering fair trial guarantees, and investigating human rights violations committed during and after last year's massive pro-reform protests. So they are implementing not only the recommendations of the BICI, but also the recommendations of this UN Human Rights Review, which, by the way, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights is what the affirmative team wants to use as the measure for their particular case. So it's important to realize that Bahrain is working towards reforming in the status quo, and therefore the best policy in this situation for the United States is not to say, well, sorry, you're not perfect, so hands off, we're not going to work with you anymore. No, it's to encourage them with our arms sales like we do in the status quo. So then, continuing on to talk about the Fifth Fleet for just a second, I'd like to read a piece of evidence from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in 2013, saying voices in both the United States and in Bahrain have called for a relocation to the Fifth Fleet as a means to compel the regime to reform. There are several obstacles to doing so. For one, the U.S. Navy has no current plans for relocating the base, either as a form of pressure or to reduce the vulnerability of the U.S. asset. There is no plan B, noted one U.S. official. So basically, they can't move the Fifth Fleet, and there are a couple of reasons for that, but they include the fact that Bahrain needs the Fifth Fleet in terms of protecting their country, and also the United States needs the presence in the region. So there really shouldn't be a fear of us moving the Fifth Fleet. That's not actually going to happen, and the affirmative team hasn't even really been sure on that point as so far anyway. So the Fifth Fleet isn't going to move, and therefore we should continue to stick with the status quo. Under the mandate, I'd really like to stress here that they can't have solvency without the criteria, some type of criteria, for when we can begin to sell human rights, when we can sell arms to Bahrain in terms of human rights. The Declaration of Human Rights contains many, many, many articles and actually says that it's impossible to meet all of them. But I'd like to read you just a few of them. One is, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. Everyone is entitled in full equality to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial trial and determination of his rights and obligations of any criminal charge against him. So those are just a couple of them. And if they have to meet those absolutely perfectly, that would mean the Secretary of State would be putting his stamp of certification saying Bahrain is perfect, therefore we can sell them arms. I'm pretty sure that's never going to happen. They're never going to be absolutely 100% perfect, and therefore we would have the disadvantage, which is going to be the fact that we're losing involvement with Bahrain. There are so many important things that the United States benefits from Bahrain. They're critical in their particular region. They're important for oil. They're important for the Fifth Fleet. So we can't just do this particular thing without any type of criteria. And it's too arbitrary. I realize it might not be reasonable to say, well, we'll just give you a number. We'll say, oh, if they meet 80% of them or 70% of them. I realize that would be difficult for the affirmative team to say. But they've got to have something other than just the Secretary of State arbitrarily deciding. Because in the status quo, the Secretary of State already has a lot of power to decide arms sales. And obviously his policy has been that we should sell some arms. And so the important distinction to make there is, again, he has chosen, and the United States government has chosen to sell things that are not used for internal, these human rights violations and things like that. The United States has made it very clear that we use them for, the arms that we sell them are used for their external defenses. And that's important because they need that for their counterterrorism and being able to combat challenges in the region. So under the advantages, again, they really can't have solvency here. They can't expect us to be encouraging reform whenever we're basically taking a hands-off approach under this particular plan. And then also the second advantage lacks significance and solvency as well. And our significance point here under the disadvantage is stability, which is kind of the inverse of the advantages. If we are not selling arms to Bahrain at all, not even the external defenses that are used in terms of allowing them the important ability to protect their borders and conduct missions along with the United States, if we do not sell them any arms at all, we're losing the stability and we're losing the ability to encourage Bahrain to reform. That evidence I read at the beginning of my speech was saying that our arms sales contribute to being able to help them reform. And this is the situation we've seen since the human rights violations in 2011. And it's important to continue to do that in the status quo. So thank you, and I strongly urge for a negative ballot, and I stand open for cross-examination.
Who decides if the Fifth Fleet stays in Bahrain? Bahrain or the United States?
I believe that would be the decision of the United States.
So the United States can force Bahrain to host the Fifth Fleet?
Well, the Fifth Fleet is so important to Bahrain that they would be crazy to try to kick them out, and the U.S. military is better. So even if they were to try to forcibly remove them, it probably wouldn't work.
Now, what if the government in Iran changed, or in Bahrain changed due to a revolution?
I'm sorry?
What if a new government came into power through a revolution, a government that was friendly to Iran, who is an enemy of the United States?
Well, I'm not sure I understand enough of the details of that government to
But it is a possibility, if they're friendly to Iran, would they probably be hostile towards the United States?
I suppose it's possible, but again, I don't have a lot of details on what that government would look like.
Now, your evidence about the UN recommendations, did it say that they accepted the recommendations or that they implemented them?
I believe my evidence said that they were fully accepting the 140. Sure. This particular piece said that they fully accepted and were continuing to put into measures, and it lists off the different ones stemming from the review. But then my partner also read from a completely different human rights, basically overview, saying that they're also working on accepting and implementing those recommendations.
Now, did you respond to our evidence from the same source saying that they had an enormous amount of progress to make and that the reforms were being made on a limited level?
I did respond to that by saying that they're not just taking into consideration what the BICI has to say, they're taking in a variety of sources, and they are working to implement reform.
All right. Would you agree that the UN recommendations and the BICI recommendations are probably roughly the same? They include the same general reforms?
It's possible, but Bahrain, the BICI is actually in Bahrain, so I would be assuming that some of them are different.
Okay. All right, now, does the United States respect the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
I would assume, since our Constitution's pretty strong, that it probably respects most of them.
Okay, now does the United States respect the rights of every single person in the United States all the time?
Unfortunately not.
All right, so you do agree that Bahrain would not have to meet the standard of respecting every person's rights all the time?
Well, at this point, I have to assume that's probably the case because you haven't given me a criteria to go off of otherwise.
Would the Secretary of State say now, in your opinion, that Bahrain is respecting fundamental human rights?
No.
All right, thank you. No further questions.
I'd like to continue a strategy that's been developed by the negative team, and I'm going to further 2 points before I enter the 3 remaining stock issues of inherency, solvency, and significance. Before we do that, I'd like to read a piece of evidence talking about how, again, human rights organizations have exaggerated the problem in the Kingdom of Bahrain. Quote, Bahrain security clampdown divides kingdom, BBC News, April 14, 2011. Quote, opposition activists have frequently been prone to exaggeration, claiming wrongly, for example, that they were being fired on by helicopters. It was very convenient. The United States sold them helicopters for external defense, and immediately after that, it was all over the news that the United States had sold them helicopters, and Bahrain had used them for human rights violations. So that's another example of opposition activists are biased. They push things, and that's the only thing that the affirmative team has stated as helicopters being used for live ammunition strikes. That's another example of they are exaggerating the situation. And also that we're not saying that every action of the Bahrain government has been justified. They kind of tried to turn our argument. We're just saying it's not all in the Bahrain government. We can't punish the Bahrain government for everything that this whole situation, because it is the protesters' fault to some degree. There's got to be a balance here, and that is why the affirmative team is failing. Now let's move into the inherency issues presented. First, their first 2 harms, and this overall affects the whole entire case. Their first harm is that arms sales were selling arms with human rights issues and all of that. But I'd also like to put to them both harms, so instead of clump them both together because they're very similar, again, arms sales with human rights and the Fifth Fleet and U.S. arms sales are being used. I'd like to again emphasize that the United States is stopping arms sales that have anything to do with human rights. Now, again, I also want to sort of bring up into this point that they said that the Department of State is putting arms sort of under the table, like not sort of like, I guess lying would be their word. And yet the Department of State, the head of the Department of State is supposed to certify whether or not they basically met the UN Human Rights Declaration. That's going to talk about that more under solvency, but that's a key point. Also, they combated our argument that they're working on the situation as well by basically saying, well, the head of the BICI said there's lots of needed room for improvement. And I would agree that Bahrain still needs to improve. But as I quote here, they have consistently carried out the implementation of the recommendations and they've made, quote, significant progress or substantial progress. That's what the evidence said. So he's saying they've made substantial progress. So they're already working toward this. And the United States has stopped arms sales. The the affirmative team read evidence from the U.S. Department of State on human rights issues in their 1AC. So we trust them on whether or not there's human rights issues. Why are we suddenly having a problem trusting our evidence now when they say they're only selling them for internal security? That is the case. We're selling them for internal security. They've quoted human rights organizations that are extremely biased as well. So we need to keep that in mind, that they're fixing the problem and we're not selling arms to them if there's human rights organizations, like human rights violations, only for external security and counterterrorism, not for internal security. Under solvency, mandate 1 is a big issue here, the UN Human Rights Declaration. They said, well, no country meets, we've argued that, and they have agreed, that no country fully meets the UN Human Rights Declaration. But where do we draw the line when they've done enough? Because there's no criteria. You have the criteria in the UN Human Rights Declaration. Where's the criteria when you've met that? Or they said no country can meet it, so when they've substantially met it, or whatever word you want to use. We've not been provided by anything in the status quo, or basically by their plan. Also, the Secretary of State, there's been some problems with reliability on his part if we believe the affirmative team that the Department of State is putting arms under the table. He's the person supposed to certify that they're respecting human rights. So there's lots of solvency issues under this point, and that immediately affects both the advantages, that there's solvency here and the adherency affects solvency as well. That they're not going to solve for them if they're basically, we're already working toward this in the status quo. There's nothing to solve for because we're already implementing that. Also under significance, we have both the harms. Once again, we are working toward this. We're pushing Bahrain to reform. That's the thing we have to realize here is we have to work with Bahrain, not just cut everything off. We need to work with Bahrain and work toward reform, cut partially, cut weapons, so that we realize, so they get the impression that we are standing behind human rights, but also work with them in fields of counterterrorism, external defense, and weapons that would protect U.S. forces, as we read evidence stating that. So again, we need to realize that as well. And under significance, under the harms, the situation of the Bahrain the Fifth Fleet moving, Bahrain is in agreement with the United States. They need the Fifth Fleet. They've read no substantial evidence that there's a danger imminent right now. So we can see it's not significant under this issue. And the advantage is exactly the same, that there's not significant issues here and they're being worked on. I'd like to address the disadvantage under this point as well, that basically we're going to be basically increasing instability by cutting arms sales altogether. We need to have the working with them approach, that we're going to show our displeasure, but still work with them. We can't just cut off a major ally. We need to be working with them, and if we don't, there's the problem for instability. When we cut arms sales to a country that is our ally, we could lose our key bases there if we were to do that. So thank you, and I strongly urge for a negative ballot.
So we're left with the two stock issues of significance and solvency, and we'll just follow the flow of the case that we've been following throughout the constructives and throughout the previous rebuttals. Starting with the affirmative team's first harm, our first harm was essentially that the United States has continued to supply weapons to Bahrain, failing to effectively use our political leverage of arms sales to stimulate reform. So essentially, what we're trying to do is provide instigation for Bahrain to reform. There's these human rights violations that have been occurring. Bahrain needs our arms, so therefore what we're doing is we're taking those arms away so that they'll reform, they'll stop their human rights violations. It's kind of like if you had a small child that was disobeying, you would take their toy from them or take the candy from them until they started behaving. So that's essentially what we're doing to Bahrain. We're providing them some sort of incentive, so if they want these arms sales back, they're going to have to reform. And we've read evidence talking about how Bahrain needs our weapons. Most of their military is actually comprised of United States weapons. So clearly, this reform would happen because Bahrain needs these, and that would be the instigation for them to reform. So that's the first harm in a nutshell, just going back to the case and recapping you on what the affirmative team is trying to do. And we had 2 points into this. Firstly, that the United States, our significance is that the United States has failed to back its criticism of Bahrain with serious consequences. And our second, that unless Bahrain is pressured, the human rights violations will continue. Now, the negative team made the argument that significant reform has been made. Now, I'd like to first note that we, the affirmative team, read evidence from their same source saying, yes, improvement has been made. I believe the last negative speaker said, okay, maybe it's true that no country has fully met the standard, but how do we know when we've done enough? And I'll address this a little later on into the mandates. But yes, it's great. Bahrain has made some reforms. We, the affirmative team, will agree with that. But there's still significant reform that needs to be made. And according to the same article that the negative team read, some of those reforms that have not been made by Bahrain have been some of the most significant and important ones that need to be made. And this was, again, from the same piece of evidence that the negative team read. I'd also like to note that the other piece of evidence that the negative team read talked about how Bahrain had accepted these procedures, but did they actually implement them? That question is left unanswered. So we see that there's multiple problems with the evidence that the negative team is reading, and we see that there's still significant reform that needs to be made. Negative team also brought up the argument that how do we know, and this, again, I'll touch on this under mandates, but how do we know whether the criteria has been met? How do we know this is actually going to happen? Now, the negative speaker in the last cross-examination admitted that at this point in time, the Secretary of State would not admit that Bahrain is following human rights procedures. They're not respecting human rights. So if that's the case, if that's in the status quo, then something would have to change under the affirmative team's plan. There would have to be some sort of difference because at this point in time, the Secretary of State is basically saying, okay, they're not respecting human rights. What's changing under the affirmative team's plan is that the standard is changing. Now, the negative team argued that basically the Secretary of State has lied in the past. But, Judge, they didn't actually use that term, but pushing sales under the table. And we did read evidence talking about how sales have gone through that have contributed towards human rights violations. However, that's because there's no standard in the status quo that the Secretary of State needs to follow. And that's what the affirmative team's plan is doing, is we're putting that standard there. We're putting that premise there that they have to follow, basically saying that human rights or respect for human rights has to occur within Bahrain, which leads to the next argument that the negative team made is that how do we know how much has to be made? Well, whatever's happening in the status quo would have to stop. A majority of that would have to stop. Even the negative team admitted not every country is following this 100%. However, much of it would have to stop. And the Secretary of State he will be able to determine that. He'll know when most of this has been halted, and will know when to put the sales back into place. So with that being said, another argument that the negative team made was that is the argument of the Fifth Fleet not being kicked out. They argued that the United States wouldn't take the Fifth Fleet, or Bahrain wouldn't kick the Fifth Fleet out. However, we, the Affirmative team, have read evidence stating that there is a chance of the Fifth Fleet being kicked out. And on top of that, Iran is backing some of these protesters up, so this could actually be something that happens. The disadvantage that the negative team argued was that we would basically be cutting Bahrain off. But actually what the Affirmative team's case would be doing the exact opposite of that. We'd be implementing an incentive, so we'd actually be pushing for reform. And so under the stock issues of solvency and significance, I urge for an affirmative ballot.
I liked the example that the last affirmative speaker used about parenting, basically saying, if a child does something wrong, you take their toy away. Well, it is not an effective parenting strategy if a child does something wrong to take all their toys away or all their candy away. And so we see that this kind of parallels basically to the situation with the affirmative team and the situation we have in the status quo. The situation in the status quo is that we work hard to make sure that we are encouraging Bahrain with our arms sales to implement reform for human rights. And they've shown that they have. And so what we're selling them is things that they need for other regional interests, such as their counterterrorism and their efforts on the border. And we've read multiple pieces of evidence about this throughout this round. The stock issue of inherency was not addressed in the last rebuttal. However, it is a stock issue we would like to continue. The points under here are that we are improving, in fact, in the status quo, and that we are, in fact, encouraging reform, and that we should not basically punish the reforms that are happening in the status quo with these complete halt of arms sales, such as the affirmative team would do. They really can't, we really shouldn't do that, and that's obviously a bad strategy. We can't just say, well, you've done something wrong, so therefore we're taking everything away. We've shown throughout this round that we have very specific interest in maintaining a relationship with Bahrain. In terms of the Fifth Fleet, the affirmative team has failed to read evidence on whether Iran is actually a factor. All they've done is talk about that, but we've read evidence to show that there's no way that the Fifth Fleet will move anytime in the near foreseeable future. So those basically cover the points under inherency. However, I would like to stop here and read a piece of evidence from the Center for Public Integrity in June of 2012 saying that the Bureau of Political Military Affairs ensures that officials vet governments as well as the companies on both sides of the sale. We only allow a sale after we carefully examine issues like human rights, regional security, and non-proliferation concerns. So in the status quo, we're careful to make sure that we are not contributing to human rights violations with our specific arms sales. So that completely violates their harms. Under the stock issue of solvency, we have the issues that the advantages basically can't come about, and the issue with the mandate. And this is such a big issue that on this issue alone, we could win the round. There's no standard for the Secretary of State. Basically, the affirmative team has given them the arbitrary opportunity, and there's no measurable way that they have put in place in their mandate, which they would need to do in order to make sure that Bahrain is complying with the articles of the UN Human Rights Declaration. And the UN Human Rights Declaration, as we've shown, contains many different things, and without knowing where Bahrain would fall on that scale of supposedly being in compliance or not, there can't be solvency with this plan because the arms sales technically would be up in the air in terms of that. So there can't be solvency here. Under the stock issue of significance, actually before I move on to the stock issue of significance, I would like to go ahead and read this piece of evidence from the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office from Bahrain Country Case Study Update in October of 2014. This is from a yet different than the BICI or the UN Human Rights Review. Basically, they offered implementations and Bahrain accepted them. They say, although there are still significant issues to be addressed, there is evidence of real efforts being made in areas where human rights concern remain. So basically, there's evidence of these real efforts. Bahrain is striving towards continuing to make their human rights situation better. So the wrong response would be to enact the affirmative team's plan because we would be basically saying, well, we're going to punish you for striving to make your human rights efforts better. So that's not something we want to do. So back to the stock issue of significance. Basically, the advantages won't be significant if they're not solvent, and also the disadvantage, which was not addressed by the last affirmative speaker. how can we possibly weigh this out? How can we possibly say that we will stop selling arms to Bahrain, all arms, not even ones used for external defense or their counterterrorism? How can we possibly do that and yet say that we are going to be improving our stability? How can we risk losing, with the affirmative team's plan, the influence that we have in terms of oil, the Fifth Fleet, the regional things that we do together with Bahrain? I'd also like to read a piece of evidence under this particular advantage or disadvantage from the same source that the affirmative team has been reading, from Richard McDaniel in June 2013. The partnership between the United States and the Kingdom of Bahrain has been extremely successful throughout the years. This strong relationship was evident when the U.S. designated Bahrain to be a major non-NATO ally in 2002. The U.S. Navy and the Bahrain Defense Force routinely operate together, and relationships between the two services is close and cooperative. Judges, this is the situation we want to maintain in the status quo. And for these issues, I strongly urge for a negative ballot.
Affirmative team starting prep time.
Quite frankly, if I was a parent, I would take away all of the candy, not just some of it. But we don't need to dwell on that. The first point I'd like to emphasize in this round is that, contrary to what the first negative speaker said, our harms are not one. They are extremely different, and neither one of them is reason enough to pass our plan. Harm one is that we're missing our opportunities to stimulate reform. Harm two is that we're giving them weapons that can be used against their own citizens. So the successfulness of our case is not dependent on both of these harms being the case. They're very different. Now, I'd like to basically consolidate the negative team's arguments into 5 main points for you to vote on in this round. The first is the issue of improvement in the status quo. Now, as we've read evidence stating from the same sources that there is significant room for improvement, there's still a lot of progress that needs to be made. The reforms have been extremely limited, and even their evidence has stated that. Yes, they may have made some progress, but they've had 4 years, and they haven't made near enough. It's time to start putting on more pressure. And I'd like to read a piece of evidence on a recent development over in Bahrain. This is from February 28, 2014, the Huffington Post. Quote, "The King of Bahrain has continued to infuriate civilians with the introduction of laws, including a ban on demonstrations. Another law imposes jail sentences of up to 7 years and a fine of up to $10,000 on anyone who publicly insults the king." Now, I don't see how the negative team can say that the human rights situation is significantly improved when things like this are going on. He's banning protests and imposing laws that put people in jail for up to 7 years just because they speak out against the king. That's what's going on. Basically, the protesters are being silenced by the Bahraini government. They're still violently cracking down on them. So the reforms have been extremely limited. And this is a threat to the people of Bahrain, obviously, and it threatens the U.S. interests, especially the stability of the Fifth Fleet. And we've quoted multiple experts saying that the Fifth Fleet is in danger. There's more potential the longer we wait for a revolution that could lead to a government unfriendly to U.S. interests. Yes, the current government wouldn't kick the Fifth Fleet out, but a new government might, and there is a great deal of risk for that, especially with Iran increasing the tensions. The second point is the issue of the Department of State already taking human rights into account. That's what the negative speaker brought up. Now, while they may consider human rights to some degree, there's no standard that they have to meet. There's nothing stopping them from going through with the sales anyways. Yes, they consider it, but they don't have to meet a standard. Our plan would change that by requiring them to meet a standard before any sales go through. The third point was the issue of, are crowd control items being supplied to Bahrain? This is basically harm two. Now, all they've done in this whole round is quote State Department officials saying, oh, we're just selling them external defense weapons. However, if we look at the actual documents that we've read evidence about that give information about what's being sold, they say that crowd control items are being sold. Ammunition, armored vehicle parts, and helicopters. So obviously, things like ammunition are being used against protesters. The government is clearly sneaking arms under the table. Now, the fourth point is the issue of the solvency of our plan. Now, there's been a lot of contention about the standard that we're having. Now, first off, they admitted that no country respects the rights of every single citizen. So respecting human rights means it's basically across the entire country. Not the individual rights, it's basically a general term, not the individual rights of every person. And they admitted that the United States respects this standard, even though sometimes the United States violates human rights as well. So respect doesn't mean 100%. And they also admitted that the Secretary of State would not be willing to admit that they're respecting this standard now. So obviously, there's going to be reform. But the difference with our plan is we're requiring them to publicly certify that they're respecting human rights for the sales to go through. That's not in the status quo. So we're putting pressure on the Department of State to actually tell us what the situation is like. They're not just going to say, oh yeah, they're respecting human rights when people are being tortured in Bahrain. They're not going to be willing to do that. And secondly, it will solve for harm too, because we're cutting off all sales, not just some things, so they can't be sneaking things under the table that shouldn't be getting through. Now, the fifth point is the issue of the disadvantage. First off, this cut is temporary. Bahrain is dependent on our arms for their military, so this will encourage reform. So once the adequate reforms are made, we'll reinstitute sales. So this is a temporary cut. We're not abandoning Bahrain. We're not decreasing our influence. We're actually using our influence. We're making use of our relationship with Bahrain. So, and according to an article from the New York Times, or pardon me, wrong article. Oh, that's right. The New York Times, February 17, 2011. Quote, Bahrain has few external security options rather than relying on some degree of U.S. security assistance, said a study by the Research Service, the Congressional Research Service, released last month. So Bahrain is dependent on us. Implementing our plan will encourage reforms that will protect the rights of the Bahraini people and protects U.S. interest. Thank you, and please vote for the affirmative team.